Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darkness of other people, and only in darkness can you see the stars. Shanks is a character that is shrouded in darkness, in all senses of the word. The first main character outside of Luffy to appear in the series has been a topic of discussion for the entirety of One Piece. Oda has left this character within the shadows of the story, but does that mean the character is someone to fear, or revere, or embrace? The scariest part about darkness is not knowing what lies behind the shadows. It's a mystery. So let's try to piece together some of the clues and shed some light on the most important character, Shanks. This video will try to connect some dots and help us learn what position he plays within the story and how he might literally be drowning in responsibilities. If you're new to my channel, the way I view the world is by making connections. So let me connect you to my vision, the ParVision. So where do I even begin? I have made a few videos alluding to the idea that Shanks is a mastermind on the tier of Lelouch from Code Geass. This video was originally within a series of videos I was making in collaboration with Mosh DMC, covering all of the Yonko. In that series, we were establishing the point that the Yonkos represent world powers that are partitioned really well and represent world powers from our own world. From a military nation that has a huge emphasis on pharmaceuticals represented by Kaido, to a utopian world that has a monopoly on the food industry and enforces a heavy communal life tax that is further enforced by a comprehensive intelligence network. And these thematic parallels continued even with Shiki, Whitebeard, and even looking at the world government. The idea being that given what we know of the past Yonko, maybe we can better understand the roles of the Yonkos that we don't know yet. Blackbeard has represented anarchy and chaos with his opportunistic nature, where through careful planning we see him take swift action that creates a wave of terror that ripples throughout the world with every motion of his dual-wielding, earth-shattering fists. It's no joke that Blackbeard both literally and metaphorically aims to cover the world in darkness, and that's where Shanks becomes even more interesting. It almost seems like the red-haired Yonko prefers to operate in the darkness. 6 years after leaving Shanks in Fuchsia Village, in Chapter 1, he becomes a Yonko. This was after he bets his arm on Luffy's future. In all respects to the Yonko title, Shanks is actually the one who stands out the most to me. Shanks looks like a completely normal person amongst a club of monsters. He has no devil fruit by the time we're in Chapter 1, and it's presumed to be the case even now. His size and appearance are literally dwarfed in the presence of the actual monsters like Big Mom and Kaido, and yet his name and presence garners the same, if not more, fear amongst the active players within the world. That being said, we have to respect Shanks because of how he presents himself. He was a part of the Pirate King's crew, and as such, the entire crew and anyone else even associated to Roger, down to Tom, the man who built his ship, was hunted and prosecuted and probably killed. I mean, can you imagine a criminal deemed so heinous you prosecute the person who built their house or car? And it was to the point even the right hand to Roger, Rayleigh, wanted to keep a low profile because had he carried a more public persona, though we are unsure if the Navy could meaningfully succeed in capturing Rayleigh, he deemed it enough of a nuisance to stay out of the spotlight, whereas Shanks brazenly became one of the most known pirates of the sea, and despite what all the other Roger pirates had to face, Shanks overcame that to the point where he can just stroll into the lion's den itself, or rather the dragon's den, the room within the Holy Land where the Gorosei control the world. Which is a conundrum on its own, right? Is Shanks evil? Is Shanks a celestial dragon? What is Shanks and who is he and why is he? I think this scene is the primary fuel when it comes to warping our perspective of Shanks. How does anyone get access to this room? We've only ever seen high-ranking Marines gain access to the session and a king, but we all know how that went for Cobra, right? I think that's something that is kind of overlooked, that if you are a kingdom allied with the world government, you could request an audience with the Gorosei, but is Shanks a king? Maybe, but that brings up another question. Regardless of if he's a king or not, there is a trend when it comes to the Yonkos, especially of Shanks' original era, which is being an emperor of an empire that spans the seas that ran a parallel operation to the world government, just on a smaller scale. Big Mom, Kaido, and Whitebeard all had expansive territories that they protected either directly with their power or simply by the influence of their flag. And that's where we see yet again Shanks stands out from the crowd here. here. To this date, Shanks has the least amount of territory. I mean, technically from what we know now, Luffy has more territory than Shanks. Shanks said Fuchsia Village was originally his headquarters, but that ended after chapter 1. Then the one other territory we know of was taken over by Bartholomew, under Luffy's name. So this one-armed, red-haired, normal-looking man with next to no territories was in the same league as these actual emperors. Now, could it be that Shanks is so strong as a fighter that it offsets all of these other deficits? While I think he may be stronger than we can imagine, I don't think there could possibly be such a strength difference that it would make this make sense. There's also not that many examples of Yonko-level fighters within the story that aren't Yonkos. The main controversial candidate for that would be Mihawk, who's said to rival Shanks, but like I was saying before, it doesn't make sense for Shanks to be declared a Yonko purely off of just strength. There has to be something that connects all the dots, and there actually is. There's a world within One Piece that connect the Yonko, warlords, world government, and even the Straw Hat crew in more ways than one, and that is the underworld. Now I know this part is a no-brainer, that Shanks is the emperor of the underworld, but I promise you it's deeper than that. I wanted to make a video about the underworld separate to this one that I could just refer to, but I hadn't gotten the time to make it yet, and will hopefully get it out in the future. But I just want to establish briefly this connection. See, the understanding is that the Yonko, warlords, and world government are the three major powers that balance each other out. But we all know that the system is broken. The corruption is rampant and the world is not just. Regardless of perspective, whether you're a pirate or a marine, you know the world is not perfect. There's a certain amount of acceptance of evil that is allowed in all regards, and we are following characters that are looking to change that. The major problem with the balance of the world powers isn't some rubbery boy who's looking to shake things up. No, it's the fact that there's collusion to such a degree, it's not even fair to say that the Yonko balance the world government's might. I'm not talking about physical strength, I'm talking about influence. See, the world government benefits from having more nations paying heavenly tribute and coming under the umbrella of protection that the world government provides. But what are they protecting from? They are primarily providing protection from pirates, but they are also prosecuting pirates too. If they were good at their jobs, why would the strongest, most oppressive world power not be able to accomplish this? Because the world is too big for them? No, because they're selective in their protection, which is fine on the surface, but it's not if they are part of the problem. We know for a fact that the CP0, an espionage group under the Celestial Dragons in Gorosei, are procuring weapons to fuel wars across the world. These wars are the ones that the revolutionaries are countering on a global scale, and we see an example of a country in the midst of war. Just look at Kaido's home, Vodka Kingdom. They were so embroiled in wars that they were essentially pirates looking to plunder other kingdoms through wars, and for what end? To be able to pay heavenly tribute. They were so desperate that they were willing to trade their strongest war asset, Kaido. Where as it stands, while he was reckless, Kaido is more relatively loyal to the cause set out by his king. Through Orochi, we have a fair understanding on how reliant on illegal weapons the world government was. And before talking about the next part, I want to add the irony of Kaido's empire. He sought to destroy the world government essentially, but his entire empire was fueling the wars around the world for the world government. So it's kind of hilarious that Kaido felt like he was threatening the world government when he was helping them out all along, which I'll talk more about in a future Wano video. But the CP0 had to go straight to the source when their golden child, Doflamingo, was taken out. Doflamingo was literally the keystone in the world, the crossroads of the Celestials, Navy, and pirates. Being a Celestial Dragon warlord put him in every single world, but more than that, he was under an emperor primarily, Kaido. Now, Doflamingo's operation is one of the most important clues to understanding Shanks in the entire story. See, when Doflamingo's empire fell, we see the ripple effect it had on the world. In chapter 801, we see that in the wake of Doflamingo's defeat, we see Rob Lucci reporting the deficit left not only by his defeat, but by the fact that the revolutionaries confiscated all of the legal weapons. Then in chapter 803, simply by Doflamingo's defeat, we see the rebel forces backed by the revolutionaries in various parts of the world were emerging victorious. Weapons were a key factor here, but just throwing out a detail I wish to expand on in a future video is that even Wapol seems to be implicated in the underworld. We find out that Dressrosa has a special metal called the Drunken Iron Ore, which seems to be a significant detail, and we know Wapol is known to be able to create new materials like Wapol metal, and this metal was so influential that he instantly became a world power through the guise of being a toy emperor, another tied to world power connection to our world. But that being said, we see even more ripples, and the one I want to focus on that is relevant to our current timeline is Buggy. Doflamingo's defeat propelled Buggy to the position in the world where it makes sense for him to be a Yonko. See, after Marineford, Buggy created Buggy's Delivery Service, which was primarily a mercenary group made up of the impaled down prisoners, and other new acquisitions like the new giant pirates. That being said, when Doflamingo's operation supplying weapons to the kingdoms around the world having civil wars, they resorted to Buggy's Delivery Service to supplement them with mercenaries. This allowed Buggy to rise in influence in the world. You could say Buggy was the biggest player that took over Doflamingo's influence of the world. Then it grew even more, actually not because of Luffy directly, but more so Big Mom. See, when we're talking about business, you always gotta look at your competition, and Buggy's biggest competition in the mercenary world had to be Germa. And because of Big Mom, Germa's entire mercenary fleet was either occupied or destroyed, allowing Buggy to rise again. Literally, Buggy's time skip character design fits him so well. We know he is like the island he is on, a man of empty bluffs, but behind the guise he is filling the space that is actually meaningful, because Buggy is demonstrating a really popular trope in terms of the underworld. See, when we talk about the underworld, the symbol of a snake and serpent is often used in junction, either as a guardian or a deity, not always in an evil light, but symbolizing life, death, immortality. But I always think about how a snake is able to wrap itself and conform to its environment. That being said, in media, you hear a quote, "If you want to kill a snake, you have to cut off the head." And this gets said in line with the underworld, pertaining to the popular myths around snakes being able to survive being cut in half, to the point where the idea of cutting off the head of a snake, and in terms of the underworld, simply creates more heads. And so an idea to properly beat the snake that is too powerful to topple entirely is to become the head of the snake yourself and control it. And we see this idea perpetuated by Doflamingo, who claimed to have the reins on all of the monsters of the world, and believed he can manipulate the world in his favor. By him being cut off, we see him being replaced by Buggy, and the other parts of the underworld also gets replaced by Buggy and other people. But you know who gets symbolized by a snake or a serpent from chapter 1, so much so that none of us even needed to see the panels in chapter 1054. The moment everybody saw the snake head on the helm of Shanks' ship, we already knew and shot up out of our seats screaming Shanks. But okay, so at this point you're probably like, this is all surface level ParVision, I already knew all of this. But are you saying Shanks is evil? Well, to that point, I think we have to recognize, just like there's many faces of evil in the world spanning from Kaido to Luffy, technically there's many faces of good, symbolized by the very fact we see the varying sense of justice amongst the admirals, but largely separated in the face-off between Aokiji and Akainu. So whether Shanks is evil or not, I'll leave that up to you and your judgment based on the end of this video. So let me start piecing together some of the ideas around Shanks to give us a better understanding of where Shanks stands in the world. But before that, if you're enjoying this video, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Okay, so snakes, Shanks, king of the underworld, power vacuums. Let's start with the easier conclusion. When I mean Shanks is king of the underworld, I mean literally the underworld, like under the world. Just hear me out real quick. I think it's important to recognize a trend we see in the Rogers Pirates besides Buggy. The three I'm talking about are Shanks, Rayleigh, and Crocus. So the trend I'm talking about is that, at the minimum, Rayleigh and Crocus had learned the true history of the world, and then returned to their normal lives. But did they? Can you just return to your normal life and just completely disregard it and not live in a way that is some way affected by the knowledge that you got from the Void Century? I don't think so. I think whatever they learned essentially influenced the choices they made. We see that unlike the Rocks Pirates remnants, the Roger Pirates are more free-spirited. Rayleigh is coding pirate ships and gambling his life away and getting captured to rob his purchasers, and Crocus, he's living in a whale. There may not be an apparent connection here, but there is. They both put themselves in a position to operate underwater. Crocus created an island and a home within Laboon, and that creates a very interesting submarine type of living environment. And Rayleigh literally knows how to coach ships so that they can operate underwater. What a specific occupation to choose for the Dark King, which, by the way, that epithet is very interesting because it uses the kanji for underworld, so it could be Underworld King too. Something I'll talk about more in the future is the concept of the worldwide flood. It might be that within the true history of the world is an understanding of a necessary flood that the Rogers pirates were preparing for, and not just them. The place Roger had a close connection to was Water 7, and what are they doing? Preparing for rising sea levels. But we also have a very obvious example with Zunisha and the red line altitude of how the world could possibly have been flooded or needed to be flooded, and that's something again I'll get into more in a future video. Wink wink, that Void Century video might be a good time to bring that up. But that being said, I think Shanks probably follows the same trends as the other Rogers pirates, that his primary mode of operation is under the ocean. Yes, we have not seen Shanks' territory in full view yet, like we've seen Big Mom, Kaido, and even Whitebeard's territories, and it might make sense that for Shanks to be an emperor with territory, yet we have not seen his territory on the ocean. It might be because he is the king of the ocean, the under ocean, the emperor of the underworld sea. But wait, Fishman Island isn't his. Yes, but realistically, that's just a small, minuscule portion of the ocean. It's not an exaggeration to say that most of the world remains unclaimed. It doesn't matter how many islands you own on the surface, the area under the surface is vastly superior to that which lies above, making someone who does claim it extremely powerful. That is a Yonko level territory, and you're probably just confused at this point. I'm saying he's a Yonko with territory that's just water? But see, we learned a lot in Fishman Island, but more importantly, to and from Fishman Island. So on the way to Fishman Island, Nami and the crew drop amazing info about sea currents, but also deep sea currents that are depicted as a giant dragon or serpent. The deep sea is understood as a dark place void of light, but also extremely cold. Then when we read what Frankie says here, and those currents are always connected somewhere. They don't just branch off and combine from west to east. They can go up and down, surfacing and submerging like a giant dragon. The sea currents flow all around the world, uninterrupted. That line is huge, but let me read just a little bit more before we talk about it. Brooke goes on to say, I heard that deep current flows very slowly near the ocean floor. If it were to carry you all the way to the bottom, you wouldn't see the light of day for 2,000 years. Yes, 2,000 years. And Brooke continues and says, that's right, there are countless legends surrounding these unknown currents too. Monsters, curses, lost souls, they're all present there, right? But you heard that, right? These currents flow all around the world uninterrupted. Do you know what that implies? Yes, that implies that it crosses the Calm Belt and possibly connects all the oceans through essentially an underwater road. If someone could run this current, they would be extremely powerful. They could appear anywhere in the world anytime on their own accord. This current, in terms of function and influence, is crucial because it allows you to overcome one of the greatest restrictions when it comes to the barriers most of the world faces. Not only that, but it's extremely dangerous and risky, and so most people wouldn't attempt to claim this. But imagine for a second all of the things you could do with this underwater road if you claimed it. Oh wait, you don't have to imagine, because this is literally the mystery behind Shanks. For one, how does a Yonko candidate manage to participate in the Grand Line but have a headquarters in the East Blue? Was the CP9 ship they attacked in the East Blue too? With this deep sea current, they could have attacked the CP9 ship and then escaped and made it to the East Blue so that they weren't pursued. But this isn't even the example I wanted to talk about. Let's talk about Marineford. It was always a wonder how Shanks appeared at Marineford despite being spotted in the New World the day prior. But not just him, Whitebeard too. It was reported that Kaido was trying to intercept Whitebeard on the way to Marineford, but Shanks confronted Kaido and stopped him. But do you remember how Whitebeard arrived at Marineford? It was underwater, which makes sense, right? If he was in the New World, to make it to Marineford, he would have to travel underwater. But the speed at which he did was so impressive. From the time Ace was locked up and impaled down and Garp went to talk to him in chapter 523 to chapter 551, when Whitebeard appeared at Marineford, is the time it took Whitebeard to come from the New World back to Paradise. But then let's talk about Kaido intercepting Whitebeard. If Whitebeard traveled underwater, that also implies that Kaido would have tried to intercept him underwater. And if Shanks stopped Kaido, that also implies that Shanks did this underwater, which makes way more sense in how Kaido would be stopped. I mean, when you think about it, right? If Whitebeard was traveling on the surface, Kaido is literally a flying dragon. How could Shanks possibly stop him or intercept him? But if it was underwater and in Shanks' territory, then Kaido would be at such a disadvantage that he wouldn't even want to clash with Shanks under those conditions. But then we get to an even crazier situation of Shanks showing up at Marineford. In chapter 580, it was noted that Shanks fought with Kaido just the day before, noting this is the end of Marineford War. Yet, despite the vast distance there was, Shanks somehow showed up at the last but perfect minute to make his impact. It honestly sounds like Shanks used a magic warp zone to get there. And that's where I'm telling you, that's exactly what he did. So what I'm imagining is that for Whitebeard to be able to make it to Marineford, Shanks allowed him to use the underwater sea currents that would give him the shortcut towards Marineford, while blocking Kaido's entry to said currents. But the thing about those sea currents, they aren't like Sonic fast, and for Shanks to get to Marineford, he needed something faster. And the thing is, Oda showed us a deep sea current comparable to a magic warp zone, and that was the White Strom, that we learn about leaving from Fishman Island in chapter 654. It was described as an enormous white whirlpool that appears without warning near the seafloor like a live writhing dragon, and Luffy said a giant sea snake. Robin continues to explain that once a ship is caught in the stream, it turns up days later, an unfathomable distance away but entirely empty, and Luffy paraphrases it all in his magic way and says, "So it's like a magic warp zone?" Because of the imagery, description, and function it has, I think if the deep sea currents are the roads of the under ocean, then this is the highway. And if you had a strong enough crew that could weather this storm, then this could possibly be Shanks' greatest weapon and also territory. And it also makes sense for so many reasons. Well, one, prior to being introduced to this sea snake, in chapter 653, the chapter before, Luffy goes, "Finally, we'll be in Shanks' sea," which just hits harder given what came right after. And an important note that I'll save for another video is that the way the Straw Hats overcame the White Strom was because of a created current by the gam of island whales that looked like Laboon. But just going back, this sea snake being Shanks' territory makes sense on every level. Not only is this quite literally someone preparing for a world submerged in water like Rayleigh and Crocus, but also Shanks' crew has no devil fruits from our understanding. So this addresses a lot of things, but there's also more. When it comes to having influence and territory, that generally implies you also have the force to enforce your influence. With Big Mom, who has the most expansive territory from our understanding, she probably has the largest fleet that travels around and controls those territories. Whitebeard had subsidiary pirate crews that defended his territory on his behalf. Even the Marines are more notable for their fleet that spans the entire world. And yet from what we know, Shanks is competing with all of them with a single ship and a small crew. But that's all he really needs if he has access to a magic warp zone. You wouldn't need a fleet if you could single-handedly be anywhere you want to be in the span of a day. I mean, this is probably how Shanks met with Whitebeard in chapter 434 in the first place. The world government placed surveillance ships around all the Yonkos, and Shanks broke through and just appeared at Whitebeard's ship. Well, we also have precedents for this. Whitebeard did the same thing, escaped the surveillance from the world government to come to Marineford. And how did he show up? From underwater. This might even relate to chapter 1054, where we see Shanks at Wano, yet he wants to deal with Barto on his territory, but also claim the One Piece. The fact that he can just be outside Wano and leisurely discuss going to other places, it just gives the air that Shanks has some kind of lock when it comes to transportation. Now, all of this in mind, this is probably the most important territory to control in all of One Piece. With the right knowledge and control of the mysterious deep sea currents, Shanks can appear in any may see since they are all connected, and through the white strum possibly at the speed of a fighter jet. Obviously that's an exaggeration, but if I use the hyperbole of speed of light, all you power scalers would be like, well actually on the pixels and acceleration of dots on the manga panels, it's not going light speed, it's more like going Mach 20. I'm just playing, but you get what I mean. From a story standpoint of the One Piece or true history aside, we can see how functionality wise controlling this is a world power. Similar to if a nation could lay claim to the entire airspace and you could only fly under their directive or in outer space. Sure, you can travel in other ways, but those other ways, especially in the One Piece world, are riddled with problems. Well, for one, Mother Nature does not discriminate up there. Then, if you're a pirate or a nation not affiliated with the world government, you could just be deemed a threat and be attacked by the world's policing force. But let's focus on that pirating aspect real quick. We see the heads of various underworld powers, right? Kaido is weapons, and Doflamingo and Kaido provide pharmaceuticals, and in order to continue their domination, Germa converted their fleet to giant snail boats that can travel over the red line and ignore most barriers other pirates face. And Big Mom is food and information, but there's a lot more that goes into running these empires. I mean, money for sure. We saw this real-world ramification of pirating displayed to us in chapter 652, where Baron Tamago is willing to take Luffy's money instead of punishing Fishman Island in order to supplement the financial loss accrued from their run-in with the kids' pirates. But even more than that, and I'll go in more depth on these characters in the Underworld video, there's a whole set of emperors of the Underworld outside of the Yonkos. See, a quick tangent real quick, one of the video series I wanted to make, especially after my Strong World movie video, was that the Underworld group seems so far removed from the story, but the fact is they've been involved in nearly every post-time skip arc except for maybe Zoe. But not just that, the premise of nearly all the movies that Oda has produced has been focusing on the Underworld. Oda has been developing the Underworld environment more concretely through the movies. Every step the Underworld takes, the world government comes and follows. Whether it's Z's nearly ancient weapon level discovery, or Gil Tesoro's Underworld lawless casino operation, or Stampede, where Buena Vista was literally introduced to us as one of the Underworld clients purchasing from Caesar in Punk Hazard. So very much in the same light, I feel like Movie Red will continue to flesh out this trend of thematics. But going back to the core focus, these Underworld connections are massive. We'll get back to the ones shown to us on Punk Hazard in a little bit, but let's focus on the ones Big Mom was connected to so closely that she invited them to her wedding party. We have Lone Shark King Dufeld, Queen of Pleasure District Stussy, who by the way is CP0, Big News Morgans obviously, Major Undertaker Drug Peklo, Warehouse Kingpin Gibberson, and Shipping King Deep Sea Currents Umit. Now, the key understanding from what we can gather is none of these people are all that strong. I'd probably put them below warlords in strength. Maybe they will surprise me, but even Stussy of the CP0 didn't seem all that strong, and she was CP0. But what we understand from these emperors is that there are more or less middlemen who accumulated a large enough clientele to make them the leaders of the respective industries. An example of how all these emperors could be used in unison from, let's say, Doflamingo's perspective, he has a stockpile of pharmaceuticals and drugs, as we see even Whitebeard use Doflamingo's medicine. To be able to ship it to someone like Whitebeard or other clients, is Doflamingo himself shipping these products? Nah, he would probably use Umit. Then, if he needed to store it, he would talk to Gibberson. If he wanted the proper pipelines, he's probably talking to Peklo. And if Doflamingo needed to front that money that he's probably getting from the CP0, then he could use a loan from Dufeld. And you're probably wondering, why wouldn't Doflamingo just do all this himself? And this is probably so that Doflamingo's operation could be kept low-key, and all this illegal contraband wouldn't be blatantly associated with a warlord. And to further that, you have Big News Morgans who can just cover everything up. And I knew Umit kind of overlaps with what I proposed to be Shanks' role, but no, it doesn't actually. It wouldn't be uncommon for other people to be using deep sea currents and claiming parts or portions of it. I doubt Umit can even use the White Strum, but that aside, it's not like Shanks stops every undersea ship going to Fishman Island, and it's not like Umit does either. He is simply a man who has a monopoly and expertise in shipping products through this obviously beneficial route for contraband. That being said, I think Shanks is also an emperor of the underworld in this regard, because there's a whole part of the underworld completely missing. We have gone through the entire time skip and not once was this obvious industry ever addressed. This industry ran rampant, not just in the time skip, but also in the latter half of the pre-time skip arcs. And yet we are nearly done with Wano and still don't know the person who is perpetuating this system. Here, I'll give you a hint at it. See, this line from Doflamingo I mentioned in a previous video would be used many times over because of how powerful this line is for the story. It was in chapter 504 when Doflamingo says, "This is the era of the smile." And I explained the multifaceted meanings this line holds. Beneath the surface, this could easily be a pun on Nika, saying that's what's next in the story, the era of Nika. But obviously on the surface, this is referring to the smile fruit, meaning that Doflamingo believes that through smiles, it would become the new primary trade in the underworld, or in the world in general. But primary trade that replaces what? So the line before says, slave trading is getting old, and that is the missing industry. Do we remember where this was? This was Doflamingo's auction house on Sabaody, just to further emphasize how far the underworld reaches. It's not uncommon to see the icebergs of it peeking out of the water, but that's just it. This auction house is just the iceberg. We have an emperor of drugs, news, food, military, warehouses, transportation, pleasure, but we still have no knowledge of who is at the forefront of the human trafficking industry. We have gone through the entire time skip and have been exposed to the concept of slavery and oppression here and there, but have yet to meet the person that supplies the people. From pirates to celestial dragons, there are purchasers. And that's the important key, right? The reason why the slave trade is so important, because it's not like the Celestials have a direct pipeline for slaves. How could they? It's not like the world government or navy are going out there and just trafficking people, yet the celestial dragons seem to have a whole population of slaves. And at that scale, how are they getting them? Are they all at Doflamingo's human auction house like it's some kind of Costco warehouse? It's not like you could supply that many Celestials with slaves, especially when we see a situation where St. Charlos felt so inclined to travel to Fishman Island himself to claim Fishman slaves. We do know of some players in the industry, some small-time kidnappers, but nothing on the scale befitting of this global issue we are seeing. So by now, some of you have your stomachs turning at the idea that Shanks is possibly the emperor of a human trafficking ring. But hear me out. See, there's not just a gap in the world for it, but there was also an established power vacuum that was primed to be filled and connects to Shanks on two fronts, the human trafficking side and Elbaf. And that connection is Mother Caramel. Mother Caramel, though alive nearly 60 years ago, was essentially one of the most prolific human traffickers in the game, operating for 50 years in total. She wanted to sell Big Mom for her admiral potential, and she did it under the guise of running an orphanage. This horrendous and disgusting operation that presents itself as a humanitarian effort, but was truthfully one of the most disgusting businesses in existence, is something that still makes my blood boil just hearing it, and I hate to say that Shanks might have been the person who filled this void. But I think it's the complete reverse situation from Mother Caramel. I think on the surface, Shanks and his pirate crew are shown as an evil force that is comparable to any other Yonko empire, but beneath the surface is some sort of justification. I mean, is there any justification for this? Well, before we talk about that, let me talk about some of the evidence that makes this make sense. Let me ask you, when you think of the red-haired pirates, what do you think of? I know a vast majority knows what I'm talking about. It's a meme, but it's not a meme without foundation. The red-haired pirates are a group of deadbeat dads, at least with two minimum examples now. Maybe that design was on purpose because they might be primarily trafficking kids and criminals. Kids? ParVision, you're saying Shanks is trafficking kids now? Yeah, let me explain a little bit. Shanks is powerful enough to have kids on his crew, just like Roger was, I'm sure of it. He himself was a child on a pirate crew. We have Luffy, Usopp, and now Uta as all examples of kids that the Shanks crew was interacting with and had to abandon. I mean, it's not like Shanks would be bad with kids. He seemed to be fine with Momo when he was on Roger's ship. My current, more headcanon explanation for this is that I think Shanks was searching for someone who carried Roger's will and could use the Nika fruit, and so he was looking for kids that could play the role. But we still don't have that much evidence for this extremely scary activity that Shanks might have taken a part of. But why does this make sense? Well, if Shanks were looking for someone to replace him and carry on the will or responsibility of Nika, then it would have to be a kid. Why kids? Because they aren't indoctrinated to the corrupt world. It's like what Otahime said. To break the cycle of hatred, they mustn't teach their children to hate others. Essentially, kids are blank slates, and so Nika would be better suited for a child. Maybe that's why the name Joy Boy makes sense. But so to just jump into a little bit more of my headcanon space real quick, this is my current synthesis. We know the world is embroiled in wars and corruption, and there's many ways to deal with it. You could be like Garp and just uphold the status quo, or you could be like Luffy and just run through every country and liberate them. Or you could be like Dragon and empower the people to instigate coup d'etats on their own. But what's interesting about Dragon is he also seems to take in refugees. We see a whole army of children being primed to fight some battle. Technically, Sabo and Koala are examples of these kids, taken from a place negatively affected by the corruption of the world. And so with that line of thinking, there is another option that Shanks might be upholding. It might be that Shanks is taking people from horrible war-stricken areas and relocating them through human trafficking. These are people and kids with no better choice, and rather than Shanks confronting the nations, he might just be relocating the people. Which brings up a big question. Is it better to struggle and die in a war, or live and be oppressed? Well, that part is clearly the gray area being explored throughout the story, where Luffy encourages people to fight and die, rather than live and be controlled. Does this justify Shanks enough? Not yet. I mean, it depends on how Oda decides to present this. But it brings up an important point. The Revolutionary Army. From all angles we have currently seen, there seems to be no collaboration or even relation between Shanks and Dragon. Which is really odd, right? Since Shanks was headquartered at Dawn Island, which had Goa Kingdom, but never was connected with Dragon at all, despite that being Luffy, Dragon, Sabo's, everyone's headquarters. It doesn't seem like Dragon has been inhibited by Shanks' activities at all, since they seem to have succeeded after Doflamingo, Big Mom, and Kaido were defeated. So it doesn't seem like Shanks would run counter to the revolutionaries. But if Shanks were a good person, why wouldn't he associate himself with Dragon? Which, given the current situation where Shanks is not associated with Dragon, it might be that Shanks' operation mirrors and flips Dragon's mission to liberate oppressed countries by empowering people. Shanks might have kid refugees, but instead of training them and empowering them, he has a more hands-off approach through and through. Being a dad and Luffy's mentor, we see that. Which is why in my Volume 52 analysis video, I suggested the idea that Shanks was hands-off, but monitoring Luffy's growth and providing aid when it was necessary. But so let's get out of this space where there's less evidence and go back to the macro picture at hand. The biggest question that would be answered by this theory in general is, one, what is Shanks' relation to Elbaf? Well, he is replacing Mother Caramel, who held a high status amongst the giants. The next question is stemmed from this scene and this scene. What is Shanks' relation to the Gorosei, and why is he treated so differently? And that's where the obvious answer comes in. If the Celestial Dragons are the largest purchaser of slaves in the world, then obviously Shanks would be treated like an esteemed guest. If they lose Shanks, they upset the pipeline appeasing the Celestials. This relationship would explain why at Marineford they stopped for Shanks and why he was allowed to enter the Gorosei room without any resistance. And I think another angle would be going back to the idea of how to deal with the snake-like behavior of the underworld. Without a Mother Caramel or Shanks, what happens? The industry would run rampant. Mother Caramel was directing and controlling it to the kids who relatively had no other options as they were orphaned. It's abusive, yes, but in a twisted, convoluted way. It's better than what we saw in Sabaody, where through sheer lust of a woman, Sharlos was willing to kill this woman's husband in front of her and thereafter enslave her. I know we're splitting hairs here, but without a pipeline, that kind of Celestial Dragon activity would increase. So Shanks may be upholding this horrible institution in the best way he possibly can, so that the Celestial Dragons don't go out of their way and enslave the masses and fishmen. Again, we saw this example with Mosgard. The moment he wanted a certain group of slaves and couldn't access them normally, he chartered a ship there himself, and we saw what chaos he caused. Shanks was attempting to prevent that. Through his evil greed, Mozgard accidentally awakened the ancient weapon Poseidon, and had it not been for Otahime and later the princes, who knows what kind of destruction Shirahoshi could have caused. This kind of awakening would have ran counter to what it seems like Shanks has been waiting for, which is the growth of Joy Boy. So to summarize this much so far, Shanks is probably the most influential Yonko, who is the emperor of the territory that lies beneath the ocean, and he uses that influence to perpetuate his secondary emperor role of the underworld as the human traffic king. But to give some clarity, I don't think it's just human trafficking. No, I think Shanks would be more accurate to be the emperor of the black market, which again is not something that is claimed at the moment. Yet it's almost synonymous with the underworld. Think about this, Shanks seems to have an expertise in tracking devil fruits. How did he find the Nika fruit? But another question we have to answer is, how did Doflamingo get Ace's fruit? And that's when I laughed, because who showed up coincidentally at Marineford? To save what? Kobe, the Whitebeard pirates, and the reputation of the world government? Sure, he would want to keep the status quo, but what if he also took the opportunity to use whatever hidden knowledge he has to also procure Ace's devil fruit while he was there? I mean, who took responsibility of Ace's burial? It was Shanks. Maybe that was even his primary objective to being there. But that aside, Shanks also kind of has a weird relation with treasure maps. He just had a treasure map that interested Buggy so much he bargained to do Shanks' bidding for him. But how did Shanks just have that, and why was he okay with just handing it out? Shanks seems to acquire these things but doesn't really have a personal attachment to any of the things he is associated with. And it might be that he supplies the black market with devil fruits and other goods too. Which makes sense, right? Because Doflamingo said he held the reins to all of the monsters in the New World. This includes Shanks, and we know Doflamingo was in the slave trading industry, and yet Whitebeard, Big Mom, Kaido, Blackbeard, and none of the established big players like the Marines or world government seem to facilitate the human trafficking that Doflamingo said was the era before the Smile Fruits. But focusing again, that's not everything. See, there's another clue that I think will play a huge role and will be important to bring up, which is there's a big question mark in why does Kid hate Shanks so much? And this is where a major parallel begins. See, we followed Luffy's journey in the Yonko saga to take down Kaido as the end goal, and the person who instigated this path was actually Law. He had a personal vendetta against Doflamingo, but Rosinante's entire mission was to dismantle everything related to Doflamingo, including Kaido. It was through Kaido's influence that we see Caesar doing the heinous crimes on Punk Hazard, so Law created a pirate alliance with Luffy to take down Kaido. And the parallel is that Kid created a pirate alliance that was stained by the backstabber Apu, but Kid's goal was to take down Red Hair Shanks. See, this vendetta, it sounds like it makes it feel like there's a comparable situation with Law. Now, we know that Kid lost his arm to the Red Hair Pirates during the time skip, and that could be the reason that he wanted to create this alliance in the first place, but then we have to ask ourselves, why did Kid enter the New World and immediately go after Shanks of all people? Shanks seems so low-key and feels like you only beef with him if you are trying to. Also, I just want to clarify real quick, we don't know if Kid actually lost his arm to Shanks himself or just his crew, but the fact still stands that Kid's priority was always Shanks. Now, is it just because Kid's jealous of Shanks' luscious red hair, or is there something else? Maybe the red hair signifies something important, something I can't get into in this video, but I promise it comes up in a future video. That being said, well, if we think of the idea that I proposed about what Shanks was controlling, then if Kid had a huge vendetta against him, then maybe we have our answer. Maybe Kid and Killer were kids trafficked by Shanks. Shanks was doing them a favor by removing them from their original environment, but abandoned them and left them to possibly an even worse circumstance, thus creating the situation of deep hatred for Shanks, which when you think about it, right, just from this small example we see, you could easily imagine how Usopp could have grown up completely different and hated his dad Yasopp for leaving him, and by proxy, Shanks too. And so all of this brings us to where we were truly introduced to not just Kid, but also Law, and ironically, it was at the human auction house on Sabaody. Kid had this line, "Celestial dragons, slaves, human shops. Compared to the mighty and their simple, pure hearts, the world's villains are much more humane. Scum rule the world and give birth to more scum. Don't they know that? We may mean to do harm, but we're sorta cute by comparison, aren't we, killer?" Did you see the focus of Kid's disdain? Celestial dragons, slaves, and human shops. That might frame our focus of why he hates Shanks too. We know that Kid isn't interested in weapons of mass destruction as it's shown in chapter 674. Killer asks Kid if he's actually interested in Caesar's weapon, but he clarifies that it doesn't hurt to know. But this scene in and of itself is a huge deal. This shows that Kid is well connected with the black market, so much so that he is monitoring it, and we even see his surprise to Killer's focus. It's a waste of time watching, and I know you're not the type to deal on the black market, Killer. Wait, they're not the type? Then why are we seeing them at the auction house on Sabaody? And this black market call, again reiterating, includes guests like Buena Vista, Baron Tamago and Peckham's, CP0, and the emperors we saw later, and a few other mystery people. That being said, something of note is, technically Law is implicated in the same way. Why was Law at the auction house? And that's where I want to insert a mini theory about why Kid, and specifically Law's crew, are largely fodder. So from our understanding, Law's crew is really weak, and I think I know why. I think Law's crew is accumulated by freeing slaves. When you think about how Law operates his crew, he kind of is a lone wolf that accepts his crew's participation but doesn't expect much of them. So my idea is that this crew is made up of people that Law unintentionally met and freed, and thereafter they became so loyal to Law that they were willing to follow him to the ends of the earth despite not all of them being fighters. And we actually see a precedence with this through Jean Bart. He is a strong captain that joined Law's crew and said, "I will gladly work under you in gratitude for freeing me from the celestial dragons." And I think in general at the moment, besides Law's connection to Doflamingo, it honestly doesn't make too much sense for Law to have been at the auction house, other than for him to find potential people that he could recruit and save. And by proxy, I think Kid is in the same boat. Kid literally said to Killer, "You don't seem the type to do anything with the black market, but here we are at an auction house that even Kid believes is more evil than he himself." So maybe it's because he was also there to get crewmates that were in a similar circumstance as he was when he was a kid, and maybe that also means maybe he was looking out for kids that might have been abandoned like him. Again, all due to part of his childhood where he might have been an orphan who was trafficked, and so maybe the entire Kid pirate crew was recruited in a similar way, where they all share a similar upbringing as Kid and Killer, and maybe even more extending, maybe they were all displaced by Shanks' crew. So now there are multiple reasons why Shanks is most likely controlling the human trafficking ring in One Piece. And now we go back to Doflamingo's line. Slave trading is the old, but it's not the era of the Smile now. The thing is, the surface level meaning never was fulfilled. The Smile's operation was thoroughly dismantled by Luffy. So by that nature, that means the era of slave trading still exists. And if the era of the Smile or Nika is to come, then Luffy has to dismantle that, which puts Luffy in a position where he will have to confront Shanks. All of this idea might be explored extremely soon given we have Kid with Luffy on Wano, and with Shanks in the mix now, it might be that we get Kid's backstory explained, and Luffy will have to come to grips with the idea that his role model might be this evil figure. And this is another concept that might be explored and hinted at through Uta in Film Red as the reason why Shanks might have abandoned her. I also want to just quickly add real quick to this topic, I don't read spoilers for One Piece of any kind, so please don't comment chapter or movie spoilers in my channel. I would really appreciate that as I do love interacting with you all, but I can't when the spoilers are running so rampant. Now, to address some of the other big scenes around Shanks, if this is the role that Shanks holds, then this explains why the only time we've seen Shanks take a grand action is when Blackbeard rises to power. Blackbeard represents chaos and terror. He is a direct counter to all the hard work that Shanks is trying to uphold. All of the other Yonkos stay in their lanes, and Shanks ran underneath everyone. But Blackbeard does not discriminate, which can be seen as a good thing if Blackbeard destroys the system, but I think Shanks has a grand plan when it comes to toppling the system, and Blackbeard's method may cause the chaos that Shanks is trying to prevent by being the keystone of the underworld. Now, two other scenes. The biggest mystery drop is what were the words that Roger said to Shanks after Laugh Tale that made Shanks cry like this? And I think this situation directly ties Shanks to the Ancient Kingdom and the Void Century. I've always felt that Shanks might have shared lineage with the Ancient Kingdom, or is probably a flat D-clan member that's being hidden from us. I think the red hair is also significant with that too. Now, that's all I'll really talk about Shanks for now. I've talked about Shanks a few times from a power perspective and narrative perspective, and you're probably wondering what I think we will expect out of Shanks. Well, I'll have a future video about Conqueror's hockey and observation hockey. I think Shanks is an impressive hockey force that will show us possibilities that we can't even comprehend at the moment. I think Shanks' Conqueror's hockey is probably strong enough to deter all of the underwater sea monsters and sea kings. And in regard to Shanks and the Ancient Kingdoms, I will be talking about this way more in the future. This might also tie into his relation to Buggy and Mihawk. If I'm saying Shanks is of the Ancient Kingdom, I think Buggy is of the Celestial Dragons. That might be the dichotomy being built up. And so now the last thing I want to do is recontextualize chapter 1 with this knowledge now. If you enjoyed this video so far, by the way, definitely drop a like, share this video, and subscribe. If you have more Shanks questions, let me know in the comments. But let's address this. You can now imagine if this is the world that Shanks lived in, within darkness. Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darkness of other people, and only in darkness can you see the stars. While Shanks was managing the darkness, he was looking for stars, and he was looking for kids, whose lights were not yet smothered by the world. When Shanks was a kid, he said Luffy was just like him, but through his adulthood and losing Roger, there must have been a certain amount of darkness growing within Shanks himself, and he recognized that he could not be the one to flip the world upside down. He found Luffy and heard the words and felt his energy and bet his arm on the future of Luffy, the star that would become a sun god and bring the world out of the darkness that Shanks had to tame and control. In a lot of ways, it feels like Shanks is Luffy's true father figure. Dragon was absent and Garp kind of just dropped him off. And from the parenting we saw, though I'm sure it was full of love from Garp's perspective, it was kind of spooky. Like high-key, Garp needs to be checked. But thinking about Garp made me realize a whole different angle when it comes to Shanks. See, one other point that gives context to Shanks is that Garp seems to hate him. He says it's because of Shanks that Luffy became a pirate, which is interesting because based on chapter 1, it feels like Luffy would have been on that track anyways. What's interesting about this is that Garp seems to be so indifferent about nearly every criminal we've seen, except for Shanks. Anytime Shanks gets mentioned in front of Garp, it's like he knows something. Now, this role that Shanks plays in the story may not be a secret to everyone. It's likely that Garp knows that Shanks is involved with something nefarious when it comes to kids, which is another interesting point because Roger seemed to point out a weakness to kids when it comes to Garp, which is how he essentially forced Garp to protect Ace. That being said, the specific thing that Garp says about Shanks is that he dragged Luffy into the pirate world, when that is literally the opposite of what actually happened. So then what I realized was Roger manipulated his execution to start the golden age of piracy and encouraged more people to search for the One Piece. So if Shanks truly wanted to help the cause, then his goal in meeting these kids in the first place might have been to inspire them to become pirates or drag them into the pirating world like Garp said, which would have helped push Roger's agenda. It's just another idea that works with this theory. That being said, it's almost like Shanks is Luffy's godfather, the man who introduced him to pirating. And so like the previous holder of Shanks's world, Mother Caramel, I think it might be apt to start calling Shanks Godfather Shanks, an epithet that has so many relevant meanings and in my opinion is so powerful and fitting. Now, I'll leave you to decide what you think about Shanks, but the biggest question right now is Shanks evil? And we see what the world deems evil. Brooks's Rumbar pirate crew was a group of musicians declared pirates. Researching history is evil, freedom is evil, and so as I mentioned before, if there are many faces to justice, there are many faces to evil. Right now, Buggy, Luffy, Blackbeard, Shanks, and even Sabo are the faces of evil in the One Piece world. So to make this make sense, I think Shanks will be a kind of evil we have not yet seen within the One Piece story, or more importantly, one that contrasts the other Yonkos. And given the fleeting nature of Shanks, he might be temporary evil. He might be a sacrificial type of evil. I want to say he is a necessary evil, but the world government and GARP kind of fit like that, but since they're a side of justice, I think necessary evil or meaningful evil could also probably make a lot of sense. Ultimately, I think Shanks will create a lot of plot twists. I think he's going to play a role that runs counter to most of the other major players. I had an idea that he might kill Garp because of my chapter 1025 cover spread analysis video. But also recently with the Yonko announcements, I was thinking Shanks would die because of or for the sake of Buggy. And at the end of the story, Luffy may have to overcome and dismantle the world Shanks is carrying at the moment. The other significant note is that Oda has said that as a character, he is most like Shanks, and I think where that applies is the mastermind aspect. If there's one adjective I could give Oda, it is a mastermind. To create the world of One Piece and plan out so many larger-than-life stories while guiding us to the end of One Piece, it's fitting how Oda seems to tease us with information and appearances, just like Shanks. And that is probably the main characteristic that relates him to Shanks, the inverse mastermind behind many, if not all, of the moving parts in the One Piece world. There's honestly so much I could say. I can't wait to talk more Shanks, but let's leave it here for today. If you liked what you heard today, come on to my streams, join the Discord, check out my second channel, ParVision VODs. If you want to support me, I have YouTube memberships and Patreon, and I also stream on Twitch quite often, 3 times a week, and I have a blast each time. Honestly, if it weren't for you all motivating me so much to make my next videos, I don't really know how I could do it. And as you can probably tell, a nearly hour-long video is really difficult to make, so if you want more things like this, consider supporting me. I counted on stream that I have like 20 scripts in queue, and I can't wait to share them all. And before I leave, as I tend to do towards the end of my longer videos, I want to direct you to related videos about the Straw Hat, the Volume 52 analysis video. Those 2 videos give you a taste of how much Shanks could have masterminded within the story. Then there's also the observation hockey video, the Buggy video, and those videos are just the tip of the iceberg. This video itself will make way more sense if you watch the rest of the Yonko series created between Mosh DMC and myself. Stay tuned for the future videos. And so, like always, thank you for connecting with me, and I'm looking forward to connecting with you all on the next ParVision.